Well, thank you for that unexpected pitch also about the birding. Corey, I appreciate that. Corey and Amy have done the lion's share of work on the Beck Lake bird surveys. So, been going for 20 years, something you folks in Cody should be really proud of. A lot of people ask me, why did I want to write a book about the bears of Grand Teton National Park and the surrounding area, Jackson Hole? And I have to admit that I didn't really, I didn't set out to do this for a long time. I didn't have a plan like, after I retire, I'm going to write a book, and this is what it's going to be about. It hit me, later, I guess. As Corey mentioned, in my last job with the National Park Service, for 16 years, I was the chief of what's called science and resource management, both natural and cultural resources. It was a great job. I loved it. And my staff of 60-ish people actually did a variety of things like controlling non-native plants, weeds in the park, and trying to restore native habitat. Removing or making more wildlife-friendly fencing, and that's a big initiative that goes on here in the Bighorn Basin area too. That's really cool. Restoring some of the decaying historic structures and dealing with non-native fish and invertebrates. That was really exciting. And one of the things I was most proud of was an effort to partner with Trout Unlimited and remove 2 of the 4 dams in Grand Teton National Park. And we did that primarily to restore fish habitat and fish passage. And I used to only half joke that 2 down and 2 to go. Think about it, but anyway. Maybe not, but anyway. But to most people, parks, at least in greater Yellowstone, mean wildlife. And protecting the wildlife, helping manage them, study them, that was all part of the responsibility of my staff. And we partnered a lot with Wyoming Game and Fish and the Forest Service, and those partnering relationships have grown a lot over the last couple decades and just been instrumental to the protection of the wildlife of your ecosystem, and particularly of bears. Of course, there are 2 species of bears in at least the lower 48 states, and black bears and grizzly bears, and both of them occupy this ecosystem. Incidentally, Corey mentioned the Parkway, and a lot of people, hopefully know that there's the John D. Rockefeller Parkway is this little unit, about 23,000 acres, sandwiched between Yellowstone and Grand Teton National Park. It was created much later than both of those, and it used to be Forest Service land. But Grand Teton National Park, since the creation of the Parkway, has managed both. So we kind of seamlessly talk about managing the park, which to me, in this case, means Grand Teton and the Parkway. But from 20 years before I moved down to Grand Teton, I did work with Yellowstone, and that was great fun and a great honor as well. And I did a lot of different things there, but primarily related to wildlife and particularly bear management. And it frustrated me once I moved to the Tetons that so many of the things that were so well known about Yellowstone's bears didn't seem to be on anybody's agenda or resonate in Jackson Hole, and yet it's not that far, it's a stone's throw. You all drive through there back and forth, commonly. And as much as we talk about the ecosystem today, I think people still just think Yellowstone is a separate entity. Well, most of you know, and if you've heard Bob Richards talk, you've seen, these pictures a lot more than I, but about the garbage dumps in Yellowstone and how they attracted people, and rangers used to ride shotgun at the bear feedings, and the former president that did that, right? Gerald Ford in the 1930s, 2 summers at Canyon, at the old Otter Creek dump. So there's this well-known story about bears and garbage in Yellowstone, and the controversy over getting rid of the dumps. And, Grand Teton has garbage, right? And even when I worked there, I'm like, well, we have dumps now, don't we? Where are they? Do bears ever go to them? Did they ever? Did people ever see bears there? Strangely enough, that became one of the first things that I was curious about. And I would even talk to people who worked in the park for 25 years, and they're like, yeah, I don't really remember about that, or I don't know where we dumped our garbage. Not on everybody's, high on their a list to figure out. But I was curious about that. And then I got to be curious about a bunch of other things, too. And I thought, surely somebody's looked this up or written this down, and I couldn't find anything. So when the COVID pandemic hit, I was retired and a little bit bored. You couldn't volunteer in town, for a while and do anything else. And so I thought, okay, I'll start researching. So I did. And it turned into a book. What can I say? Biologically, there is one population of bears in the ecosystem of each species, by and large. They range far enough, and particularly with grizzly bears, this one population has been contiguous and studied, as an entity for 50 plus years now. I'm not doing my math right, probably more than that. There's some differences, of course, around the ecosystem. Some bears have access to fish, spawning streams especially. Some of them have access to the high elevation moth sites. There have been talks here, in this series about that, such as this. Neither one of those opportunities exists in Grand Teton National Park. And even the spawning cutthroat trout have not yet, to our knowledge, been taken advantage of by bears in Grand Teton, although they have in Yellowstone. And some of that's just about, slight habitat variability around the ecosystem, what people have access to. So those kind of differences I talk about a little bit when I talk about the science of bears in Grand Teton and what's similar and what's different from Yellowstone or the rest of the ecosystem. And of course, there's the commonality of the debates about, should you capture and mark bears? How much do you need to do that? And give them numbers or whatever, such as some of the numbers you've probably heard of. But the ecosystem as a whole has some great biological, incomparable biological, and now social science about bears in this ecosystem. And I don't mean to say that the parks did all that either, because the states, particularly the state of Wyoming, has been instrumental in a lot of that and in partnering together to study these species for the purpose of learning better how to protect them and their habitat and how we can live with them. That's not to the detriment so much of either of us. So I think the value of that science is extremely important, and we should always, I think, hope that good science like that continues in some form or another. Even if grizzly bears, change status legally, we're still going to need to know how they're doing in order to continue to protect them and to protect us. And without good science, we won't know what we don't even know. The human history of bears in Yellowstone National Park particularly is somewhat different from really every place in the ecosystem outside of that big rectangular 2 million acre park. Yellowstone was essentially never settled by Euro-Americans. And that's not true of West Yellowstone and Sunlight Basin and Jackson Hole and the area that's now Grand Teton National Park. In the Bighorn Basin, there's some commonality for Jackson Hole and here. If you think, why should I care about bears over there? Well, in the first place, they're the same bears, and I appreciate your interest in those. But in the second place, our home here is more similar than Jackson Hole than ever Yellowstone National Park. Here, we have summer homes, we have private lands, we have ranches, we have still operating cattle ranches, we have dude ranches and timber operations, and that kind of thing is not at all bad in any way. It just doesn't occur inside Yellowstone National Park. So whenever people talk about Yellowstone and what's known about bears and people in Yellowstone, they don't have to deal with any of that stuff, and they never did, basically. So this book, I wanted to tell a little bit richer this part of the story of this corner of the ecosystem. And the book studies the history of bears and humans' evolving relationship in Jackson Hole and Grand Teton National Park from the 1870s, which is when William Henry Jackson took the first known photo of Grand Teton from what I call the backside, the Idaho side. But and black bears have been here throughout, of course. Grizzly bears were trapped and reported well south of the valley of Jackson Hole, by early settlers, but were essentially eliminated from the area by the 1940s. And for 40 or 50 years in the middle of the 20th century, they were gone from Jackson Hole. And then they began to return in a fairly big way. So I encourage you to think about how attitudes about bears and toward bears have maybe evolved throughout the past century, And so whether it's in or outside the national parks, how do you and other humans, past and present, think about bears? Do you think about them as a source of entertainment or curiosity? Do we think about them as a source of conflict, a management challenge? Maybe as competition in some form? Do we think about them as a source of income or recreational attraction? A threat to our safety or our livelihoods? Do we think about them as celebrities, as inspiration, or some combination of these? Early on, bears in this ecosystem were a curiosity, and some locals in Jackson Hole even had pet bears, with maybe one exception. That didn't happen inside Yellowstone either. And famously, some of you may know that in the early 1920s, Jackson, the town of Jackson itself, had the first all-female city council and mayor, I think, like anywhere. And Wyoming is proud of its, equal rights history in that regard, with positioning women early on in positions of influence. And so they had a mayor, Grace Miller, in the early 1920s, and she had a pet bear. This picture is a little bit hard to see what's going on here, but this is actually the bear. You can see the bear's nose there, and there's a guy kind of standing over her, kind of helping, I don't know, corral the bear or something. And they drove it around in her truck. I don't know what, she took it to the meetings of the city council or whatever. And she was not the only one around Jackson to have a pet bear. These were all black bears, thank heaven. There are also a dozen or more dude ranches in what's now Grand Teton National Park. Some of them even remain. And all of those places, of course, had garbage, and they just threw it out the back. Every dude ranch had its own dump. So one of the first things I found out about dumps was not so much about the administrative ones that the Park Service, managed in the park, but the fact that all these dude ranches had them. And at the same time I was working on the book, folks who had been associated with the old Whitegrass Ranch, which was the third oldest ranch in Grand Teton National Park, were doing a history. And the people that worked there and stayed at Whitegrass just loved that place. And they'd have these reunions, and they'd share stories and send forward pictures. And some of them were just really wonderful to share with me their stories of living and working or visiting for the summer the Whitegrass Ranch. And so this is one of the pictures that was shared with me of, bears were all the time just wandering around the cabins, and the workers would just kind of ignore them most of the time, or shoo them away, using pots and pans, whatever worked. Anyway, that's just kind of curious to me and fun to hear those stories. But it is certainly a very different time, right, than now. Those of you who live rurally, maybe even in Cody, get reminded all the time, beware of your bird feeder. Store your dog food, right? Don't keep attractants outside. Something might break into your shed. And can you imagine just walking around kind of ignoring that, just taking that for granted year after year after year? I find that interesting. But anyway, so until the 1960s at least, ranchers, residents, even park and wildlife managers, frankly, were quite casual about conflicts between bears and people. And especially in Jackson Hole, it was all black bears at that time. And I think there's always been this kind of they're just black bears attitude. Like, they can't kill you like grizzlies can. Not true, of course, but there is that kind of casual attitude. And some of these pictures show, of course, Yellowstone iterations of trying to come up with what they called a bear-proof garbage can. And this one, you still see some of these. They're now transitioning to different models, but occasionally you'll see these. We call these the mailbox top ones, And most of the time, these were pretty immune to bears getting into them. But there was a famous bear in Yellowstone that figured out if he squeezed the bottom of the can, the top would pop off, and then they called him the crusher. and anyway, the garbage would spill out. And I could find no pictures of this, at Grand Teton, so I don't know if it was happening or not. This is a much more recent picture when I was working at Grand Teton of unsecured recycling stuff outside. So it's a reminder that it doesn't have to be smelly food and garbage. Just even putting the recycling bin outside is enough to, attract a bear, which is not necessarily a good thing. The Interagency Grizzly Bear Study Team, which still exists today and hopefully will in the future, was created in 1974, and within the first few years of their work, they identified two key threats to survival of the Yellowstone grizzly bear population, which was, of course, listed as a threatened species under the Endangered Species Act in 1975. And the first of those threats was garbage dumps. They said, you gotta quit. Yellowstone had already begun to clean up its garbage. Grand Teton followed a little bit behind. Okay, they're doing that. I guess we got to do it. And there were national edicts to do that. And laws began to be passed to promote better sanitation all around for our water quality and our own health. So that was good stuff. The other, what I tried to find, and still honestly have never been able to pin down too much, but there's some, in the historic record at Grand Teton, there's some notes, allusions to bears at the dumps, or bears beginning to beg along park roadsides and people going to see that. I could not find anybody who held up their hand and said, I remember doing that. And this would have been 60s, maybe 70s. I have pictures. So if anybody knows of that, come up and talk to me later, because I'm still hoping someday to find a picture of that, in Grand Teton National Park, or what's now the park. Grand Teton National Park actually had 3 dumps, and it was fun to talk to some of the old maintenance guys that worked for the park. Some of them were still working there when I got there, and then had subsequently retired, and they told me these great stories about driving around, dumping the trash, and at 4 o'clock in the morning by themselves. They didn't really always want to get out of the truck and see what was waiting there when because they thought there were some bears there, but it was dark, and so they didn't know if they were black bears or grizzly bears. But there were 3 major dumps in the park, and the biggest one is now just a landscape feature, but it's called Timbered Island. It stands out quite a bit in the park, because it's pretty flat, the Valley of Jackson Hole, and there's this kind of a small butte or mountain, and it is called Timbered Island, and the big dump was right at the base of Timbered Island. But there was also one at near the little town of Kelly, and there's one still today at Coulter Bay. Well, bears do compete with us, of course, for space and how we use it, and to make our living, have fun, whatever. And so competition, particularly with domestic sheep allotments, was the second major threat that was early on identified as something that had to be dealt with on behalf of the grizzly bear population. And again, this is something Yellowstone never had to deal with. Unless one wandered in occasionally, which I never heard of, there were no domestic sheep or cattle ever grazing inside Yellowstone National Park. Grand Teton, different story. Technically, the sheep grazing did not occur in the park, but it occurred on the very boundary of the park with Idaho and what's now the Caribou-Targhee National Forest. And even after grizzlies were protected under the Endangered Species Act, dozens of bears kept getting removed for conflicts with sheep. And so when I was a editor of a magazine called Yellowstone Science, when I actually worked in Yellowstone, the man that had been the first head of the grizzly bear study team from 1974 on, his name was Dick Knight, Dr. Richard Knight, and he retired in 1997. But he had led the team that whole time, and anybody who knew Dick, and I know there's some people in the room that knew Dick, he was quite a character. He was very blunt, very direct. He had punched his academic ticket, but he could go into a room and schmooze as well with ranchers and livestock owners particularly, which was a very good skill to have in his day. He never became a typical bureaucrat, if you will, and I really liked that. Even though he was a well-trained independent scientist, he could respond to questions from forest supervisors and park superintendents, from reporters and curious students of bears, and often in quite a blunt, newsworthy way, shall we say. But when I interviewed him at his retirement for an article published in Yellowstone Science, I asked Dick about the effort to remove the domestic sheep grazing allotments from what I think of as the backside of the Tetons, the Teton crest on the Idaho-Wyoming border. Hundreds of sheep once grazed on the Caribou-Targhee National Forest, and to some degree even north of there on the Gallatin. And when I was in graduate school at the University of Montana in the early 1980s, I remember they were discussing this. Speakers would come and talk to us, and Forest Service managers, and one of them was just bemoaning that so far they'd not had success in removing the domestic sheep allotments, and he was afraid that would mean the demise of the grizzly bear. So Dick Knight said, yeah, we were really involved in that. It took a long time, and the forest supervisors they just didn't want to believe that grizzly bears and sheep couldn't coexist. But finally, we got those allotments out. And I said, so, sheep and grizzly bears are truly incompatible? And he said, well, it's the herders that are really incompatible. Grizzly bears really like sheep. So there's a whole chapter in the book that documents a few of the studies that were done. There weren't many at that time, but there literally were hundreds of sheep allotments and sheep grazing on those allotments, hundreds of conflicts. And kind of the irony is that the vast majority of those sheep were killed by black bears, not grizzly bears. But both species were controlled legally and illegally. There was a fair amount of under the cover kind of talk about that. There's a quote that I found it was actually a published research paper, and then when it got republished in a different form, the line went out. But Dr. Knight actually said, don't send all those wildlife agents up there to figure out what's going on. He says, go into the bar with a 6-pack of beer. I'll figure out more about, how many sheep died. I love that. But today you wouldn't find that in a technical scientific publication. There's a whole nother chapter that I devote to detailing the long history of cattle and bear conflicts and the work to try and reduce those in Jackson Hole. In its first half century, Grand Teton had about 24 ranches permitted to graze cattle, and a few of those actually still remain today. In the 1940s, many of you know the name Adolph Murray. His brother Olaus was famous for studying elk, particularly in Jackson Hole. But Adolph Murray studied wolves in Denali, Mount McKinley National Park then, and bears, actually, in Grand Teton National Park. And so he did a little study in the 1940s of bear predation on cows in what's now Grand Teton National Park. Some of it was the park then, a lot of it wasn't. But 50 years later, this came to mind. I'm like, oh my gosh, things cycle around. And in the 1990s, at least 85 or 90 cattle were killed by grizzlies in a place called the Elk Ranch in what's Grand Teton National Park today. It was then, too. And this also happened on the adjacent Black Rock Spread Creek allotments. Park rangers, I still can't get over the fact I found these forms in the file. And maybe this is just for bureaucrats, but government, the government's got a lot of forms, and they all have a number, form number, whatever, it's down at the bottom. And I found this form, and they're like blank, with the picture, the sketch of the cows. And then rangers would, when there was a case of depredation, they would fill out what's called a case incident report and document the incident, and they would draw pictures. This part eaten, this part bite and claw marks, this part bite and claw marks, ripped off and eaten, And there were any number of these in the Grand Teton National Park files from the 1990s. I think that still just, amazes me. And we still have that form there today. But Wyoming Game and Fish actually did a special study of those depredations and discovered that basically there were 2 or 3 grizzly bears responsible for the vast majority of those depredations. And so 2 of those bears were actually dealt with in a management sense, and one of them was removed from Grand Teton National Park and killed. Now, this is pretty standard procedure today for dealing with bears that prey on livestock. But it made big news at the time because this happened inside Grand Teton National Park. And most people, like me working in Yellowstone then, didn't even know there were livestock in Grand Teton National Park. didn't think that you'd remove a grizzly bear for killing livestock in a national park. So that was a big controversy in the 1990s. And one of the things that surprised me after I moved to the Tetons was how many people seemed to have maybe forgotten that incident because they were surprised when grizzly bears started to be seen again. To this day, livestock depredation remains one of the largest reasons that grizzly bears are either relocated to a different area or removed from the population in Wyoming and elsewhere around national parks. And if you make your living raising livestock, bears and other predators can be a notable source of competition. So other people began to look for different solutions, and in 2003, the late habitat biologist with Wyoming Game and Fish, Steve Kilpatrick, and conservationist Hank Fisher with the National Wildlife Foundation, at that time, National Wildlife Federation, worked with some private landowners to buy grazing rights, first on the 88,000 acre Black Rock Spread Creek allotment. And they bought that from the Walton Ranch, which is a big ranch in Jackson Hole, and that operated grazing up towards Cody Pass for 50 years. So this was a really big deal. And it launched an effort that continues today, to purchase from willing sellers livestock grazing rights where possible, or to do things like remove or modify fences to make them more wildlife friendly. And that's I made reference to that before, but here's an effort, going on in Grand Teton National Park where we work to remove fence from the elk ranch or make it more wildlife friendly. And then we also, during my tenure between 2005 and 2011, we worked with a different livestock permittee in the area around Pacific Creek, if you know where Pacific Creek and Two Ocean Lake are, on the edge of Grand Teton National Park. We worked with them to move cattle from what was a free-range allotment, and it was prone to wolf and grizzly bear predation. We had a vacant allotment, if you will, on the elk ranch, which is fenced, and you can see those cattle today if you drive through Jackson Hole and you're going up toward Moran Junction, from Jackson towards Togety Pass, and you see cows on the east side of the road. You probably think, oh, that's not in the park. Yes, it is. And they are still permitted. The Pinto Ranch is the last remaining grazing permittee in Grand Teton National Park. There have been no cattle killed in the park since 2001, and hopefully there never will be again. But gotta always keep watching. I mentioned that we may think of bears as a source of competition, not only with our livelihoods, but with recreational opportunities, and those include hunting. And hunting, most people know, is not permitted in most national parks, but the Rockefeller Parkway legislation does permit hunting. This was Forest Service land before it was made the Rockefeller Parkway, in honor of the many conservation efforts by John D. Rockefeller Jr. And so because it had been Forest Service land, there were some debates about whether to change hunting, and they just grandfathered it in. So even today, between Yellowstone and Grand Teton National Park, people can hunt in the Parkway, and they hunt ducks and elk and deer and even black bears. For many years, the record grizzly bear taken in the state of Wyoming was taken in 1938, and it's this bear right here. And if you know the parkway, I can just about tell you where this picture was taken from the 1930s. But look at the vintage car, and it's near the north end of Jackson Lake, and it was taken by a man who actually worked on the Grassy Lake Reservoir. And it measured out Boone and Crockett. The numbers are, I got them from the McCracken Library, actually, the record. The record was eventually broken, and a larger bear or two grizzly was taken. But this one still, I think, remains the third largest grizzly ever taken in Wyoming. And hunting did, of course, stop for grizzlies when the population was listed under the Endangered Species Act in 1975. But between 1970 and 1974, in this corridor area, I think it took a while for the laws of the Parkway to kind of kick in, and bears weren't listed then. Hunting was allowed, so there were at least 4 grizzly bears killed in the area either of the Parkway or right adjacent to the Parkway before 1975. And those, again, are some of the last legal grizzly bears taken in Wyoming. This became quite an issue in discussing potential removal of the grizzly bear population from the endangered species list. And I was involved in a lot of discussions in the latter part of my tenure with the state of Wyoming and the National Park Service directors, and it culminated in the state of Wyoming saying that it was not their intent to permit grizzly bear hunting in the Rockefeller Parkway should the animals be removed from the endangered species list. But whether it be for income or for recreation, people and bears often like the same things in the same places, and so it's notable that we would see an increase in all of us and in the associated risk. There's a greater likelihood we're going to encounter bears when there's more of them on the landscape and there's more of us on the landscape, whether we're out there working our beehives or enjoying the corn maze, in Clark, or just walking around Grand Teton National Park. When I worked there, the staff used to dig out of the records and they'd say, 8 or 9 people, had had conflicts with bears in Grand Teton. And when I started digging, I'm like, no, there's at least 24 bear incidents. And they only go back to the 1960s. And before that, I couldn't find anything. So that doesn't mean that nobody got hurt. But and a total of 27 people have been injured by bears in Grand Teton or what's now the Parkway. In the whole ecosystem, bears have killed 20 people since the late 1800s. And when they record that record, that does not include the one that I call a black bear-related fatality, which comes from Grand Teton. The rangers recorded it as a bear-related fatality. But what really happened was a poor woman who was hiking by herself in 1985 appears to have come upon a black bear by surprise. To get away from it, she climbed up a tree, 60 or 70 feet. She fell out of the tree and died of her injuries. And all this story was just put together when she didn't turn up home. Rangers went looking for her and they found her the next day. So, but they called that a bear-related fatality. And that's the only one so far in Grand Teton National Park, and hopefully it will be the only one. But of all the incidents that I could find, 75% of the incidents involving black bears, the black bears were what we call food conditioned, used to getting in the garbage, breaking in the cabins, the dog food, whatever, or habituated, which means they become very tolerant of human presence, maybe hanging along the road, begging for food, whether or not they got it or not. Or they were both, black bears, habituated, food conditioned. The grizzly incidents, 75% of them were surprise encounters by hunters, even if they were hunting elk, or deer. They involved females running into females with cubs who defended themselves, of course. 3 of the incidents more recently were directly hunter-related, associated with Grand Teton National Park's elk reduction program. And even though hunting is legally not allowed in Grand Teton National Park, it has this special legislation that allows for an elk reduction program to help manage the population. And in 2011 and 12, there were attacks in the park where a hunter went in maybe to get his elk from the day before, or was trying to clean it up and surprised a grizzly bear, with or without cubs, who responded, to defend what they then thought perhaps was their kill, or just to protect themselves. And so there is an ever need for vigilance for that kind of activity, whether it's in Grand Teton National Park or out. We want everybody to be safe out there on the landscape. I think when we go to enjoy ourselves, hunting, fishing, recreating, whatever. Because bears can, of course, cause serious harm to people. And so you have seen the increased efforts for decades now for wildlife managers and other people to get us to store our food properly, to manage our trash, our recycling, to not roll down our windows and throw something out the window so the bear will come up and want to not only get what you want to throw to them, but break in your car and get more. We've done a bunch of social science, proudly starting actually in Grand Teton in about 2010. We said, we're sending out all these messages. We put up all these signs. What's working? And so we hired people from the University of Wyoming Social Science Center first to come and do an analysis of that. And subsequently, Yellowstone has now done some of those surveys. And we've learned a lot about, we hope, what messages work. Keep them simple. Be attractive, use a little red, but don't try to scare people to death, And there have been all these campaigns to promote the use of things like bear spray as an add-on or perhaps an alternative to using a firearm to potentially protect yourself in case of a surprise encounter with a bear. So many people appreciate bears and other animals that it's a growing source of income and recreation-based income. I want that mug, incidentally, if anybody ever sees one. So people sell the image of the animals, they lead tours, they guide hunting opportunities and wildlife watches, and you've seen the growth of this, in the Cody community and beyond. This is becoming more and more popular. It benefits local communities, and I think a lot of visitors appreciate the added education and benefits that could come from either purchasing, wildlife-related items and having expert trip leaders. So I think that's a good thing. Increasingly these days, we also see the phenomenon of celebrity bears. And this didn't start in Grand Teton, but it certainly reached new heights, I think it's fair to say, there with the visibility and fame of grizzly bear number 399. Is there anybody in the room that never heard of grizzly bear 399? I'm just kind of curious. It's hard to find somebody that didn't hear about that one way or the other. She entertained and challenged wildlife watchers and park managers for nearly 20 years, from shortly after I arrived there. She's kind of the opening story in the book, until 5 years after I retired. And sadly, she was hit by a car last year in October at the age of 28. So I talk about social surveys about bears, about people's attitudes, about celebrity, and about the pros and cons of such animals that are so habituated to people, because there certainly is an associated risk. Bless that bear's heart, she was lucky to live as long as she did, because she hung out so much on the roads. And there's a lot of traffic, and people don't even mean necessarily to hit anything. Obviously, you don't have to be speeding. I almost hit the darn bear one night. It was at dusk, and she came flying across the road. And fortunately, I was able to, hit my brakes and, not have an accident. But there's no doubt that 399 and bears like that reflect the expansion of grizzly bears into Grand Teton National Park. And they drove the corresponding growth of the bear management program. When I arrived at Grand Teton National Park, we didn't even have a separate bear management program. Now we have food storage boxes in every campsite, in a 30-plus person brigade called the Wildlife Brigade, and they do things like manage these. I heard the Twitters. This literally, I love this gentleman. He's sadly he passed away some years ago, but he was one of the great volunteers on the Wildlife Brigade early on. And this young woman was literally going to and from her wedding, but they all stopped, for a bear gym on the Moose Wilson Road. So this is how people get excited about these kinds of things. But you can see from also the picture, just look at the proximity of people and bear and cars. And it made all of us just, oh my gosh, you're worried about the bears, you're worried about the people, you're worried about kids. You got kids and they're so excited, they're just opening the car doors and they're running out, and mom and dad are maybe trying to protect the kids, but also get the picture of the bears or whatever. It's just still it makes me nervous, and I'm not even there, and it's not happening now in November. But so it's a great challenge, and it occurs again more and more on the North Fork and in other places. So people need challenges to deal with. I saw that world's supposedly most famous bear many times. And although she's not absent from my book, I don't focus on her. I've always preferred to think about such visible animals, or raspberry, jam. Some of you would know those names of bears that hang out on the North Fork or up towards Yellowstone Lake. And I think that such visible bears like that present wonderful opportunities on how to educate the public, but hopefully it's educating them about bears in general and not about that particular one. About how we can better coexist with all of them. And so to end the book, I contrast the famous bears with one of my own favorite encounters, which had long gone, was far less renowned, but in my view, it was just as special, more representative of the wild animals in the ecosystem, because most of the bears out there, and any other species of animal, are never named, caught, numbered, or, quote, known. So if you'll indulge me, I will read a story. And if you want to read the really whole story, or know the whole story, take a look at the book. But this involved us, when I was still working at Yellowstone, And I like the connection about the two parks too, because they are always integrally connected, and I love them both equally, differently but equally. The story started in Grand Teton, in Yellowstone, but it ended in the Tetons. And in 1990, wildlife managers, actually from the state of Montana, had trapped a mother grizzly who then was numbered number 79. I always say I age myself. Now the bears are numbering up close to the 1100s now. And I can remember some of those double digits. Yeah, well, that's just time. What can I say? 79 had 2 yearling cubs that year, and she frequented the northern part of Yellowstone, and she was a really good bear. But in good years of apple crops in the town of Gardner, sometimes she would be prone to get into town and be stealing the apples in the trees when she was hungry. And so we decided to trap and move that family of bears. We were helping the state do that. And we were going to relocate her to the far reaches of Yellowstone National Park and the yearling cubs to the Rockefeller Parkway. And trapping situations are a strange combination of hurry up and wait. Anxiety to get the bear out of harm's way as soon as possible, and that's tempered by each animal's indifference to just what we think. Trapping a family group is especially tricky, as inevitably each bear has its own idea about whether or when to get in a trap. This group had taken a few days to round up, but we wanted to release those 1.5-year-old siblings together to increase their chance of surviving without the helpful watch of mom. Official rules required us to not keep grizzlies in traps for any longer than necessary, ideally no more than 24 hours. So that made us eager to get on our way to our respective locations. Our ground crews would face hours in the still heavy visitor traffic of summer. The helicopter could not fly after dark, and all of us were headed about as far across Yellowstone National Park as one could go. But before the move could happen, number 79 had to be in the right trap. She had been caught in an old corrugated metal tube on wheels, 8 feet long and 3.5 feet or so around, likely scrounged from some old stream culvert material and weighing hundreds of pounds. An open mesh of 2-inch squares covered the end opposite the solid trapdoor. Such open-ended traps had been common for years, but biologists had learned that bears often broke their teeth or claws on those grates. And as quickly as time and funds allowed, we were replacing the old models with aluminum tubes, smooth-walled on both ends, where the dangerous grates had been. These traps had small side windows that one could open from the outside to check on a bear's welfare, or when needed to reach in with a jab stick holding a syringe of immobilization drug to put the bear to sleep prior to placing a radio collar or ear tags on it, or taking biological samples from the bear. Yellowstone had invested in some of the newer smooth-walled cylinders, which were also considerably lighter weight than the older culverts. Each had a welded metal attachment atop the center to facilitate the trap being hooked to a cable suspended beneath the helicopter. So our challenge was to move 79 from the old steel culvert in which she sat to the newer, lighter aluminum trap for her ride to freedom. We met at park biologist Carrie Gunther's rented park residence, a ramshackle historic 2-story house outside of Gardner. Though Yellowstone Park resource biologists, like me and Carrie, were in charge of management captures and relocations, but on this occasion, we gladly left the lead to study team trapper Jamie Jonkel. Jamie had experienced this rodeo before, a savvy adult bear 79, probably none too happy to have been caught, and needing to be moved from an old culvert. Jonkel told us how in that prior instance he had connected 2 traps together, like we did today, so he could move her to a smooth-walled, smaller trap, but the bear had other ideas. She sized up her temporary confinement cell until she found just enough purchase for a claw, then ripped the 2 traps apart and escaped. It's hard to picture in the abstract, even thinking you know how strong bears can be. This time, we watched as Jamie backed the lighter aluminum trap up against the closed door of the culvert, holding the mature mother grizzly. Under his strict direction, we jacked both traps up and down on various combinations of wooden and concrete blocks found in Gunther's garage. And once the doors matched as closely as possible, Jamie opened the newer cylinder and used large clamps to hold them together in multiple spots. He would not be rushed, repeatedly circling and eyeing the traps intently and periodically moving close to adjust and tighten the fasteners. And the whole time, Bear 79 sat quietly in her cage, barely moving. After what seemed like hours in the late summer sun, Jonkel was finally satisfied with his efforts to secure the two traps end to end. He stationed us carefully as well. A young seasonal employee held a long rope tied to the open door of the aluminum trap with strict instructions to drop the rope the moment he was signaled. Carrie Gunther and I were told to stand silent and still, positioned off to the sides of 79's trap where she could not see us. Jamie raised the door of the old culvert, and we waited motionless for a while. But the bear didn't budge. She sat unmoving as she had for hours, quiet in the smelly culvert, wet with her drinking water and urine and remains of the bait that had tempted her in. Jamie looked at his watch and said softly, "We have to get going." Without warning, he grabbed a long, sturdy stick from the bed of his pickup truck and walked quietly back and forth along the length of the bear's trap, banging on it and yelling as loudly as I'd never heard him, "Move, bear, move!" In an equally abrupt response, 79 bolted at least twice, from the far end of the aluminum trap, then back to the near end of the old culvert, where she rammed her head toward that grate and claws into the bars, anxious to find her way out. And next to me, Carrie Gunther stared wide-eyed, as I'm sure I was, transfixed by the speed and power of that grizzly, as she showed her pure strength and urge to break out. Within seconds, Jamie yelled, "Now!" And the seasonal dropped the rope, trapping the bear in the newer, cleaner trap. And as suddenly as the commotion had started, it was over. Jamie turned to us and said softly again, but with insistence, "If you want a bear to do what you want it to do, you've got to be aggressive. You've got to be dominant." My heart was still beating fast. My mental picture of that bear's sudden flip from a position of silently waiting to a sheer display of wild capability remains as vivid today as it was then. Thank you. Perhaps most of all, bears can be a source of inspiration. Some people are moved by just knowing that there are such animals in the wild, particularly if they live in places where they're lucky enough to get to see them. I'm inspired by the recovery of a species protected throughout the lower 48 states since 1975. Grizzly bears are increasingly reoccupying not only the Tetons, that happened by about the mid-1980s, and it kept expanding over the last 4 decades. And this is at the same time that visitors and residents, as you know, and in other areas of Jackson, around Jackson Hole and the ecosystem, have also been booming in number. So that's a wonderful thing. It's an inspirational thing. Comes with significant challenges. We still need the scientists and wildlife managers who monitor the population and habitat and share information on their status and work to minimize human-bear conflicts. And it needs the buy-in from residents and visitors and landowners, ranchers, hunters, everyone, to try and live together on this landscape. I think bears provide a source of optimism about how we can coexist with such a large and dangerous predator in the ecosystem and elsewhere, if we choose to. Thank you for coming, and I will take any questions if you have them.